A nation does not need to hate you to destroy you. It only needs your land, and the patience to take it slowly. Before there were borders, before there were states, before there was a flag raised over this continent, there were nations here already. Not wandering tribes, not scattered camps, but societies with laws, trade routes, agriculture, diplomacy, and memory stretching back centuries. They had names for their rivers, stories for their mountains, burial grounds older than the idea of America itself. And then came a promise written in ink, spoken in courts, and repeated in speeches, that expansion was destiny, that removal was necessary, that disappearance was inevitable. But history tells a quieter, colder truth. This was not chaos, it was policy. Treaties were signed knowing they would be broken. Borders were drawn knowing they would move. Reservations were created knowing they would fail. Entire peoples were marched, starved, confined, and erased, not in secret, but in the open, under law, under banners of progress. What followed was not a single massacre, not a single trail, not a single tragedy. It was a system, one that converted land into property, culture into obstacles, and survival into compliance. And when the dust settled, a continent had changed hands. This is not a story about the past. It is a story about how power justifies itself. Because the land remembers, even when the history books do not. And this ledger entry begins where the myth ends. Before America was discovered, it was already known. Known by the people who lived on it, named it, farmed it, defended it, and buried their dead beneath it. Long before the first European map tried to flatten this continent into empty space, North America was home to millions. Not scattered wanderers drifting aimlessly across wilderness, but organized nations with borders understood, if not always drawn. The Haudenosaunee governed through confederation and consensus. The Mississippian cities rose with earthworks still visible today. The Pueblo peoples engineered water systems in desert landscapes where survival itself was an act of knowledge. Trade routes stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, from the Atlantic to the Rockies. This was not untouched land. It was managed, cultivated, and shaped by human hands. Forests were cleared intentionally. Fields were rotated. Game populations were maintained. Fire was used not as destruction, but as design. What Europeans later described as pristine wilderness was, in truth, a landscape curated over generations. But the myth required emptiness, because land that is inhabited must be negotiated for, and land that appears empty can be taken. So the narrative was simplified. Complex societies became tribes. Diplomacy became savagery. Spiritual systems older than Christianity were dismissed as superstition, and millions of lives were reduced to a single, convenient word: obstacle. This reframing was not accidental. It was essential. To justify ownership, the original owners had to be diminished. To claim civilization, what already existed had to be declared uncivilized. And so history, as it would later be taught, began at the moment Europeans arrived, as if time itself had been waiting. But nothing was waiting. The land had memory, the people had law, and the continent was already alive with meaning. What came next was not the meeting of equals, nor the inevitable clash of cultures. It was the slow construction of a story, one that made removal sound reasonable, displacement sound humane, and conquest sound like progress. And once that story took hold, everything that followed became easier to justify. Because you cannot steal a home if you first convince the world that no one truly lived there. Conquest does not always arrive with soldiers. Sometimes it arrives with documents. As the United States expanded westward, violence was not abandoned. It was reorganized. Treaties became the preferred weapon. Between the late 1700s and the end of the 19th century, the U.S. government signed hundreds of treaties with native nations, each one framed as an agreement, each one presented as lawful exchange, and nearly all of them broken. Land was ceded in return for protection that never arrived. Boundaries were guaranteed, then redrawn when settlers crossed them. Promises were made, knowing enforcement would quietly fail. When native nations resisted, the response was not reconsideration, it was reinterpretation. Courts ruled that tribes were domestic dependent nations, sovereign enough to sign treaties, but not sovereign enough to enforce them. Congress claimed authority over indigenous land while denying indigenous authority over themselves. Law did not restrain power, it refined it. Removal was reframed as necessity, displacement as benevolence, forced migration as protection from extinction. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 did not declare extermination, it declared administration. Paperwork replaced chains, signatures replaced gunfire, and the result was the same. Entire nations were uprooted under the banner of legality, marched beyond rivers they were promised they would never cross, and confined to lands deemed useless until value was discovered again. When resistance flared, treaties were cited. When treaties failed, courts deferred. And when courts hesitated, Congress intervened. Every step was recorded, every decision archived, every loss made official. This was not lawlessness, it was order. A system designed not to ask whether land should be taken, only how efficiently. And by the time the ink dried, removal no longer looked like theft, it looked like governance. Migration implies choice. Removal never did. When the orders came, they did not ask, they instructed. Entire nations were given deadlines. Leave now or be forced later. Sign or be surrounded. Families were driven from homes they had built, fields they had planted, and graves that held generations. The marches were framed as relocation. They were, in practice, endurance tests designed without mercy. People walked hundreds of miles through heat and freezing rain. Food was scarce, shelter was improvised. Disease moved faster than any supply line. Children weakened first, the elderly followed. Those who collapsed were often left where they fell. The Trail of Tears is remembered by name, but it was not singular. Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee removals echoed the same pattern. Different routes, same outcome. Death was not an accident of the journey. It was a predictable consequence of indifference. Supplies promised in treaties failed to arrive. Transport contracted for profit cut corners. Military escorts enforced movement, not survival. And yet, the official language remained calm. Reports spoke of logistics, of numbers moved, of operations completed. Loss was not measured in lives, but in distance covered. By the time the marches ended, entire cultures had been fractured. Social structures collapsed under strain. Languages dimmed as elders disappeared. Communities arrived already grieving. This was not relocation for protection, it was displacement by design. A policy that understood suffering, accepted it, and proceeded anyway. Removal cleared the land. What followed would ensure it stayed clear. Mass killing did not need to continue once survival itself could be controlled. After removal came containment. Reservations were presented as refuge. In reality, they were instruments of dependency. Land deemed undesirable was assigned permanently until value was discovered again. Then boundaries shifted. Once more. Food systems were dismantled deliberately. The bison were slaughtered by the millions, not only for profit, but for leverage. Hunger became policy. Rations replaced autonomy. Compliance replaced freedom. When food failed to arrive, starvation followed. When treaties were violated, appeals vanished into bureaucracy. Resistance was labeled hostility. Survival was framed as ingratitude. Children became the next target. Boarding schools were designed to finish what removal began. Hair was cut, names were changed, languages were beaten out of mouths. The goal was not education, it was erasure. Kill the culture and the people would eventually disappear, on paper, if not in body. Families were separated across generations. Memory was interrupted. Identity was treated as a defect to be corrected. This was not genocide by battlefield. It was genocide by administration. Slow, documented, respectable. By the end of the 19th century, native populations had collapsed by millions, not through a single catastrophic event, but through layered systems of deprivation. Land loss, food loss, cultural loss, legal loss, each survivable alone, lethal together. And through it all, the language remained reassuring. Civilization, progress, assimilation, words chosen not to describe reality, but to soften it. What could not be destroyed outright was dismantled quietly, and what remained was expected to fade. The violence did not end, it settled. By the early 20th century, the frontier was declared closed. The war no longer needed a name. The land had already changed hands. What remained were boundaries drawn small enough to manage, isolated enough to ignore. Reservations became permanent reminders of temporary promises. Fragments of once vast territories, surrounded by what had been taken. The land held in trust was rarely the land that sustained life. It was arid, remote, economically restricted by design. Opportunities were limited. Jurisdiction was fractured. Authority remained external. Poverty was not incidental. It was the predictable outcome of confinement without resources. And yet, survival continued. Languages endured despite suppression. Ceremonies persisted in secret. Memory passed through families, even when institutions tried to break the chain. What could not be erased, adapted. Today, native nations exist within borders imposed upon them, governed by laws that still question their sovereignty, negotiating with a system that has never fully acknowledged the cost of its expansion. Land claims remain unresolved. Treaties remain unfulfilled. Sacred sites continue to be threatened by development framed as necessity. The story is often described as historical. It is not. Its effects are measurable in health outcomes, economic disparity, and legal battles still being fought. This is not inherited victimhood. It is inherited consequence. The land remembers where rivers once ran freely, where migrations followed seasons instead of statutes. And beneath modern roads and cities, the foundation remains unchanged. Taken, renamed, built over. A nation rose from this transformation, celebrated for its growth, rarely asked to account for its methods. Because accountability requires memory, and memory, when it becomes inconvenient, is often the first thing removed. History often asks us to believe that what happened was unavoidable, that expansion required sacrifice, that progress demanded loss. But inevitability is usually a story told by those who benefited. What happened to Native America was not a mystery of the past. It was a sequence of decisions, signed, funded, enforced. The language was careful, the process orderly, and the consequences devastating. This was not a failure of ideals. It was the successful execution of priorities. Land was valued more than life, growth more than continuity, control more than coexistence. And once the system worked, it did not need to be repeated. It became precedent. Today, the land still bears the shape of those decisions. Borders follow old removals. Infrastructure rests on cleared ground. Prosperity rises where absence was engineered. What remains are nations that were never conquered in war, yet were dismantled through law. Peoples who survived not because the system spared them, but because they endured it. Remembering this history is not an act of guilt. It is an act of clarity, because a country that refuses to examine how it was built will never fully understand how it governs. The Dusty Ledger does not ask for absolution. It asks for acknowledgement, that this land was not empty, that disappearance was not accidental, and that what was taken was never truly forgotten. The ledger remains open, because history does not close its books. It waits for someone to read them honestly.